Hello and welcome to Season 5 of the MRX Lab podcast, the show from FlexMR, where this year we're on a mission to uncover the many ways market research shapes and is shaped by the world around us, and also learn how to navigate a fast-changing commercial landscape. I'm really excited for this episode to be joined by Emily James, Content Manager at FlexMR, with over 5 years of experience marketing, research, and insight. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So before we jump into today's topic, could you maybe start us off by sharing a little bit about yourself and what you do in your day to day?
So I'm the content manager in the FlexMR marketing team. What I do is I manage the written side of the content production. So I create a fair bit of that written content, the marketing collateral, website copy, case studies, press releases, blogs, that sort of thing. And I also manage the social media channels for the company as well.
And can you tell us a bit about how the marketing team at FlexMR, which we should clarify, is the research and insight agency that we both work for, how that team operates?
Yeah, so there's three of us. Obviously, there's you, Chris, there's me, and then we have a graphic designer, Sophie, as well. The way we operate is we kind of have our own little areas that we manage. I'm the content production, your strategy, and Sophie manages the graphic design side of things. So we are fairly independent, but we do come together to collaborate on tasks and projects and have our own say that way.
So let's talk a bit about market research. And I want to start on the creative side of the question. So I suppose quite broadly, from your perspective as a copywriter, a content manager, what makes good advertising?
Well, from my side, I do tend to pay more attention to the copy side as as a copywriter. But more broadly speaking, I think insight-driven, tailored to the target audience, spurs them to act on like the purpose of the advert. So if that was to buy a product, it would get them to buy the product essentially as the primary function. But I think a good secondary function would be to keep the name of the brand in the conversations of consumers. So the more aware they are of your brand, the more they're able to kind of talk about it, and that's like almost free advertising off the back of paid advertising. I think that's in my opinion what makes good advertising.
And why is it important for insight teams to pay attention to marketing communications?
So there are many communications techniques that we use in marketing. So we have a lot to offer in terms of being a good example of how to engage consumers, engage customers through different marketing channels, different marketing formats. So there's advertising as one format, but then there's also social media as another, which the communication techniques used for different formats will be different depending on who you're targeting. We tend to use a lot more creativity just on a daily basis, I think, in all tasks and projects, just because of how we have to make every communication unique, even though it's along the same lines, and it has to follow a particular project or a task or a theme. Each communication needs to be unique and engaging and targeted towards the audience, which is kind of what insight experts should almost do with stakeholders when they're trying to engage stakeholders. So using storytelling, understanding where the right people are, where they are communicating, what times they're communicating at. So in social media, there'll be different times, different times where you can post different posts to get a certain type of audience. So just before lunchtime, if they're going on their lunch breaks, or if they're working parents, then you might want to focus it just after the school run, or just before you put the kids to bed. So they'll go onto the social media and they'll see the post essentially. So taking the same methods and employing them when engaging with stakeholders, I feel like that can really help insight experts maximize the impact of their insight communications.
Right. So in marketing, for example, we talk a lot about brand consistency and the importance of repeating the same messages, but telling
Yeah.
it in different ways so that it's memorable each time.
Yes.
And your advice would be to take some of those learnings from marketers and look at how, as research teams, you can use those to engage your stakeholders as well.
Yeah, definitely. It's always been a very poignant challenge trying to engage stakeholders, especially with research budgets being slashed. Insight's not necessarily being given the power to change strategies or direct them, guide stakeholder decisions as much as they used to. And we communicate things in different ways. So maybe it's the format that insight experts are using, or the channel that it is not quite where stakeholders are. So understanding how marketing teams engage consumers and stakeholders as well. There might be some new ways in which insight experts can sort of revolutionize their own communication strategies to give insights the best chance of success.
And I've heard it mentioned a few times now that there's almost a negative connotation. Some people argue that the label market research itself holds the industry back, and that actually to market the work that we do as an industry better, we need to be broader because we're competing in an information-rich environment where evidence comes from a lot of different sources, and it's not just market research teams anymore. What's your view on how market research can cut through that noise and essentially advertise itself internally as a good, trusted source of information?
Almost using marketing techniques to brand the insights team as the one and only source of official insights. I wrote a blog about it recently, actually, that there's a fair few conflicts within businesses, and they usually stem from organizational silos and those data conflicts. So the silos within businesses means that those teams are generating data in their teams, but they're not letting it flow throughout the rest of the business. Or if they are, because they're not communicating as much as they should, sometimes those data sets that they've generated conflict. And understanding that the insight team are able to both manage the process of data generation and insight generation, but also they know the context behind all of the research projects, so they might know why those data sets are conflicting, and they'll be able to kind of hone the one true view of the customer across the organization.
So I think one of the interesting things you mentioned there is this idea of frequency of communication. As marketers, even, it's quite difficult to stick with the frequency of communication on one message for a long time. But in actual fact, that's one of the most effective ways of building messaging, being consistent over a very long period of time. But even for us advertisers, marketers, it's difficult, and especially insight teams. Then it's hard for us to expect them to have that consistency of weekly communications with the rest of the business, saying the same things. I think we often have this fear that if we're not saying something new and revolutionary, it's not worth saying. But really, just having that cadence of regular communication is still really important. But importantly, if we're going to do that, we have to write in engaging ways. So as a copywriter, what's some of your advice on what makes engaging writing?
There are a lot of different things. I am a copywriter, but I also come from a creative writing background as well, which are very related disciplines. They just have different focuses. So creative writing is like fiction, script, poetry, that sort of thing. Whereas copywriting is more specific to businesses, writing for customers for a specific purpose. So there are aspects of both that are really interesting and that I would not preach, but I would encourage people to take up and experiment. So expanding your vocabulary and understanding the meaning of each word that you're using really helps you to maximize the impact of your written communication. So you are communicating exactly what you want in whichever way you're using. So I'll use like CTAs as an example. So if you're writing a newsletter, you'll want, it's not necessarily about just communicating the insights, but getting stakeholders to act on them as well. So after each insight or section of the newsletter, just saying, instead of saying, oh, do something with this, you can encourage them to share. So say something like, what have you done with these insights? Can you share this with us? That sort of thing. And that will hopefully get the conversation going from stakeholder to stakeholder, not just about the insights, but also about what they're doing with it. Creative writing, if just practicing a little bit each day, experimenting with form, language, structure, so that you're not putting out exactly the same thing every time. I'll use the newsletters as an example again. If you're sending out the same newsletter with the same structure, the same sort of format, it kind of gets a bit samey. People don't necessarily pay attention to it as much. So experimenting with that structure. The language you use might not be able to, if it's corporate language, corporate tone of voice, you might not be able to experiment quite as much, but definitely the structure and the format, you can kind of switch things up a bit.
I think also, or at least I wonder about the idea of hooks in copywriting. I'm a big advocate of the inverted pyramid as a journalistic style of writing. Communicating your most important information first. I think that's a real risk, especially with insight, where we like to be very detail oriented, that we write in almost an academic way, that we put, this was the goal of the project, this was the methodology, this was the analysis, and then the findings are way down at the bottom. Whereas if we take a more journalistic approach to it and we say, actually, forget the detail, that comes last. The longer a page is, the more someone has to read, the less likely they are to reach that point. So our most important, our key facts, our headlines have to be above the fold. Who, what, when, where, why, how. Answer those questions first, and then don't bury the lead. What is the hook for someone wanting to read more? I think also acknowledging that not everyone has to read everything. But if we present it in a hierarchical order where the most important information is first, then hopefully 90% of people read that. And then maybe 20% of people make it down to the detail. But it's better than 90% of people not making it all the way down to the results and the interesting parts. So I wonder, as a copywriter, what your thoughts are on those kind of different styles of writing and the importance of ordering information.
I think it really depends on who your readers are, what their reading habits are. Are they, as you say, ones that only read the top, like the summary at the top, or do they skim read almost all the way down? So they do read, but they don't necessarily read every word or every line. So you can instead of communicating insights through a report or the newsletter with the typical structure, you could maybe using headlines, subheadings to draw people's attention to certain sections, so it will be more applicable to them, as you say. But always making sure that in those sections you still have the summary of it at the top, like the first sentence to make the point, and then the second or the first few sentences to make the point, the second few to explain and then expand, and maybe the last bit, because even though people read the top, people also kind of read the bottom, just in case there's a little summary there. So instead of a summary at the bottom, you could link it to another subheading, and they'll maybe go read that a little more, just to kind of get a bit more context. But yeah, it's really one of the best things you can do is to have conversations with your stakeholders, see how they're communicating, what format they like most, and how to the point you need to be, or how much detail you can put in based on what they read. Everyone likes to think that they read everything, and it's just not true. So reading between the lines in a way is more effective than anything else when it comes to those conversations.
I think that's another area which maybe marketing and research are both strong advocates of, but don't always practice ourselves, is understanding our audience. We understand a lot about our customers and our consumer audiences, but how well do we understand our internal audiences, the people inside the business making decisions, how they digest information, when they're reading, how they're reading, what communications are going to be most effective for them.
Exactly, definitely, and using a multi-method approach will be a lot better than just like a single method of communication. In multimodal as well. So I'm not sure that's the right word, but instead of just having like the newsletter going out and putting all your insights in there, also have the lunch and learns, where it's important to talk to, what you can in person physically talk to the stakeholders and build that connection with them. And in those conversations, you will get to learn a lot more and more about how they communicate and why, and not necessarily having that explicit conversation of, hey, how do you read things, but more, oh, hey, did you see the newsletter? What did you think of it? That sort of conversation is great for like insight workshops. You can learn a lot there too.
I think I was speaking to someone client side recently who also mentioned just the idea that researchers should look to be helpful, which sounds really basic. But what it means is that, if you take a marketing perspective, we don't just look at communications, we look at things like customer satisfaction, customer service, in-store experience, how helpful are our staff being to the people who are buying from us. And as a research team, it's not just about the work we're doing, publishing that into the organization and assuming it's going to be helpful. It's about asking the question, what do you need to know? And that's a question which is sometimes not always asked, or not asked in the right forum, or sometimes people just don't know what they need help with. And there's opportunities in very informal settings like those lunch and learns that you mentioned, or even just a water cooler chat where you're talking about what you're doing, where you can say, rather than, oh, you should read this report, you can say, oh, good point. Do you want me to ask? our customers about that for you?
Yeah, and even conversations like, "Oh, hey, what did you think of the last research project? What did you do anything with those insights?" Like getting that feedback of what did they do will also open up questions of, "Hey, do you need anything else? Was there anything off the back of this that you would find incredibly helpful?" Yeah, definitely.
So, what are some of the marketing skills that you would recommend researchers, insight professionals look at investing in?
Storytelling, as a storyteller. The more soft transferable skills for sure. Just the storytelling, but also the more interpersonal skills, because that's how you build the connection with stakeholders. That's how you are able to hold more conversations with them and get these opportunities for more really. But yeah, definitely. So there are building connections with the marketing team will help you build those skills just naturally. You can maybe ask the marketing team to hold workshops for the researchers on different areas. So storytelling, graphic design, just communication skills, understanding the customer and how deep an understanding you need to be able to communicate well with them. So that's probably what I'd recommend.
So very much branching out of that data collector box and
Yeah.
not just saying, we run research, we report, we distribute, but actually investing in all of the little things which go around that, like networking, storytelling, essentially being a good social agent of change within the business.
Yeah, I think another one I'd add too is just creativity as a broad concept, like maybe creativity workshops or something. And it could be not necessarily data oriented, but looking into other different industries that you don't think are even related to market research and seeing their storytelling techniques or their creative techniques, how they operate and how you might be able to embed some of them into market research.
And a good plug for another recent episode of the podcast. 2 episodes before this, if you jump back in our timeline, you can watch our interview with Harry McGill, creative strategist and filmmaker, who talks a lot about how to invest, how to build storytelling skills, how to make compelling film, the role of a good script, understanding your audience, but also telling compelling stories, making engaging visuals, and interestingly, the role of music and sound in all of that as well, engaging all of the senses.
Yeah. Listen to that. That was a brilliant episode.
Emily, I think that brings us just about to the end of today's episode. But before we go, what's the one thing you'd like our audience of insight, marketing, advertising professionals to take away from the last 20 minutes?
Probably that stakeholder engagement and communicating with stakeholders is just like communicating with customers or respondents. It's incredibly important to build those connections, just because you're able to give more power to the insights that the researchers generate, and breaking down those organizational silos through those connections will it'll help nurture synthesis throughout the entire organization. So yeah, understanding and communicating with stakeholders on their level is probably the one thing that I'd say take away from this.
So the work that you do looking at, understanding, communicating with customers and consumers, reflect that internally as well, and put the same amount of effort into understanding your business and your decision makers.
Exactly. Yeah.
Emily, thank you so much again for joining me today. Been fantastic to chat.
No worries. Thank you for having me on. It's my first podcast, so I'm very excited.
And thank you also, as ever, to everybody listening. We'll be back next month with a new episode featuring Ian Stanfield of Specsavers, discussing the value of investing in organisational research skills. But until then, I've been your host, Chris Martin, and this has been the MRX Lab.